The sky over Earth had always seemed calm from space, a gentle blue and white marble floating in the darkness. But that peace was about to be disturbed. Far beyond the orbit of Mars, a fleet of massive ships appeared, silent and glimmering, gliding toward the planet as if it had been waiting for them all along. These were not explorers or travelers. They were extractors, beings who saw planets as nothing more than sources of wealth. For them, Earth was a treasure chest, filled with untapped minerals, rare energy pockets, and resources they had long since exhausted in other systems. The extractors' first scans showed the planet's surface was rich beyond imagination. Mountains teeming with minerals, deep oceans hiding energy currents that could power entire civilizations, and hidden caves full of crystalline formations that shimmered with raw power. They did not care that life existed here. Humans, with their cities and fragile technologies, were insignificant compared to the riches beneath the ground. The extractors moved in silently, sending down automated drones that began mapping, drilling, and taking samples without warning. But Earth was not entirely defenseless. The first signs that something was wrong appeared subtly. Earth's crust, which had been stable for thousands of years, began to tremble in ways that defied natural explanation. Scientists in seismic labs noticed strange patterns, rhythms in the vibrations that were not caused by tectonic shifts or volcanic activity. Satellites detected unusual energy readings from deep within the planet, faint signals that pulsed like a heartbeat. At first, researchers thought it was a new kind of natural phenomenon, a rare geological anomaly. But soon, reports came from all over the world. In the deserts of Africa, sandstorms rose without warning, swirling in shapes that seemed almost deliberate. In the dense jungles of South America, trees twisted unnaturally, and animals became restless, fleeing from areas where the ground seemed to hum. Along the coasts, fishermen reported seeing massive structures emerging beneath the waves, glowing faintly in colors that no one could identify. Even the night sky seemed to shimmer differently, as if the planet itself was reacting to something awakening inside. At the same time, the extractors continued their work. They were careful not to reveal themselves fully, sending robotic machines to dig, drill, and extract resources. They believed they had complete control, assuming nothing on this planet could stop them. But with every strike into the Earth's surface, with every mineral they pulled out, they were unknowingly awakening something older than humanity itself, something that had been lying in wait for millennia. The first visible signs of this awakening were small but unsettling. Power grids around the world experienced sudden surges and blackouts. Weather patterns grew unpredictable. Tornadoes appeared in places where they had never formed. Rivers shifted their courses without explanation. Scientists scrambled to explain these changes, but their theories all failed to account for the underlying cause. Something beneath the Earth was stirring, responding to the intrusion of the extractors. News media began to pick up on these events. Headlines spoke of strange phenomena, unexplained energy bursts, and unusual seismic activity. People around the world grew curious and worried. Some dismissed it as natural disasters or freak coincidences, while others feared that the planet itself was in danger. Governments began sending specialized teams to investigate. They deployed satellites, research vessels, and deep drilling probes, hoping to understand the sudden surge of anomalies. But they were too late. The forces they were trying to study were already reacting deep in the Pacific Ocean, in an area that had never been mapped thoroughly. Strange shapes began to move beneath the surface. Massive metallic forms, ancient and covered in patterns no human could decipher, shifted as if awakening from a long sleep. Their surfaces glimmered with energy, and they moved with a purpose that defied human understanding. These were the first glimpses of the Guardians, constructs that had been placed on Earth long before humans existed. They had been dormant, lying beneath oceans, mountains, and deserts, waiting for the day when the planet's safety would be threatened. The extractors, focused solely on profit, failed to notice these movements at first. They continued to extract minerals from the ground, unaware that their actions were triggering the reactivation of these guardians. But soon, the machines they sent to collect resources began to malfunction. Drills jammed inexplicably. Harvesting drones lost power mid-air. Communication with the orbiting ships became erratic. The extractors tried to diagnose the problem, but their advanced technology was no match for the ancient systems of the Guardians. Meanwhile, humans began witnessing things that could not be explained by science. In remote regions, some villagers reported seeing colossal shapes rising from the ground, covered in metal and stone, with eyes or lights that glowed like fire. Others described hearing deep, resonating sounds that vibrated through the earth itself. These were not hallucinations or myths. They were the first signs of the planet defending itself. The Guardians were beginning to stir, and their presence was becoming impossible to ignore. Dock in the orbiting extractors' fleet, alarms blared. Machines that had been functioning perfectly started shutting down. Some of the ships experienced minor tremors, as if the planet itself was reaching up and shaking them. Panic spread among the extractors. They were not prepared for resistance from a planet they had assumed was inert, unguarded, and defenseless. For the first time, they realized that Earth was far more than just a resource-rich world. It was alive in a way they had not understood, and the forces awakening below would not allow them to continue their exploitation unchecked. Humanity, still unaware of the extractor's presence, was left to piece together the strange events happening worldwide. Scientists began noticing connections between earthquakes, magnetic disturbances, unusual weather, and energy surges. Though no one fully understood what was happening, there was a growing sense that Earth itself was reacting to something external, something unnatural. The unusual patterns were too coordinated, too purposeful to be mere coincidence. The first part of this awakening story ends with the planet sending its first warning. Tremors shook cities that had never experienced earthquakes. Lights flickered in remote areas where human technology was almost non-existent. And deep beneath the surface, the Guardians began to rise slowly. Sensing the intrusion of beings who had come not to explore or understand, but to take dock by the end of this first stage, humanity remained mostly unaware of the full danger, and the extractors still assumed they could control the situation. But the truth was undeniable. Earth was no longer a silent world. It had begun to awaken, and what had been sleeping for thousands of years was starting to prepare for what was coming. This was only the beginning of a story where the stakes were no longer resources, but the survival of the planet itself and everything living on it. People all over the world began to notice that something strange was happening on Earth. At first, the signs were small and easy to ignore. A sudden tremor in a city far from any fault line. Birds behaving oddly, flying in patterns no one could explain. Oceans that moved strangely, waves rising and falling in unusual ways. Farmers noticed that rivers were changing their courses, cutting through fields that had always been dry. Weather, too, had grown unpredictable. Snow fell in places where it had never fallen before, while thunderstorms raged in deserts that had gone for decades without rain at first. Governments tried to calm the population. Scientists and officials explained the events with words that were meant to comfort. Natural anomalies, climate fluctuations, rare seismic activity. But as weeks passed, it became clear that these were not normal occurrences. Entire regions reported phenomena that could not be explained. Entire islands in the Pacific registered energy pulses that even satellites could not account for. Villages in the mountains reported seeing strange lights coming from deep inside the earth. And in forests across continents, trees bent and twisted as if moved by some invisible force. In major cities, engineers and power grid operators were alarmed. Electrical systems experienced surges that could not be traced to any known cause. Communication networks went down unexpectedly. Traffic lights blinked in patterns that made no sense. At first, technicians thought it was sabotage or technical failure, but no amount of repairs could fix the problem. Every system that depended on electricity or energy showed small signs of disruption, enough to worry the experts. People in remote areas, far from technology, noticed changes that were even harder to explain. Fishermen on the coasts began to see shadows moving beneath the waves, massive shapes that disappeared when they got close. Hunters in dense forests heard sounds that were deep, rumbling, and unidentifiable. Villagers in deserts reported feeling vibrations in the ground, as if the earth was alive and reacting to some unseen force. Some dismissed it as imagination, others as superstition, but the number of reports grew too large to ignore. News channels picked up the stories. Strange lights, unexplained tremors, and unusual wildlife behaviors were broadcast across the world. People began to share experiences on social media, uploading videos and photos that seemed impossible. Governments could no longer claim these were isolated incidents. Something was happening on a global scale, and no one had a clear explanation. Amid this growing chaos, scientists began to notice patterns. The energy pulses, tremors, and unusual phenomena were not random. They followed a rhythm, almost like a signal. Some researchers hypothesized that the Earth itself was communicating in ways humans could not yet understand. They pointed out that deep beneath the crust, readings of magnetic and seismic energy were rising in intensity. It was as if something enormous, something ancient, was awakening. Deep in the oceans, this awakening became more obvious. Massive structures, long buried in the sand and mud, began to stir. Ancient forms made of metal and stone, some stretching hundreds of meters long, moved with a purpose. Their surfaces glimmered faintly, and energy pulses ran along their edges. These were not natural formations. They were guardians, constructs designed by a species long extinct, built to protect the planet in times of great danger. Their presence was subtle at first, hidden beneath the waves, but as the extractors continued their drilling and harvesting, the guardians were forced to respond. Humans were unaware of the extractors at first. To them, the disturbances seemed entirely natural, though extreme. But the more the guardians responded, the more visible and undeniable their presence became. Villagers and explorers began witnessing these massive structures emerging from oceans, deserts, and forests. Some described them as towering forms with patterns etched on their surfaces, glowing faintly in colors no human had seen before. Others reported feeling vibrations in the ground, deep sounds resonating, as if the planet itself was speaking. In laboratories around the world, scientists struggled to understand what was happening. The energy readings from beneath the Earth's surface were unlike anything recorded before. Some instruments melted or failed under the intensity of these pulses. Research vessels sent to deep oceans reported interference with their sonar and communication systems, sometimes losing contact entirely. Satellite operators detected faint energy signatures moving beneath the planet, often in ways that defied physics. Despite these challenges, humans began to respond with curiosity and determination. Teams of geologists, oceanographers, and physicists collaborated across borders to study the phenomena. They mapped the areas of highest activity, measured the energy pulses, and documented the strange movements of wildlife. Every new discovery brought more questions than answers. The planet's response seemed intelligent, deliberate, and powerful beyond comprehension. Meanwhile, the extractors, high above in orbit, grew increasingly frustrated. Their machines, once precise and efficient, now failed without warning. Harvesting drills jammed or were destroyed. Scanners picked up signals they could not interpret. Communication between their ships became erratic. For the first time, They realized that Earth was not the silent, defenseless planet they had assumed. The forces awakening below were older, stronger, and more intelligent than anything they had ever encountered. Humanity, though unaware of the extractors, began to notice that the disturbances were sometimes helpful, not just dangerous. In some areas, the energy pulses seemed to heal the land, restoring forests damaged by human activity, purifying polluted rivers, and stimulating crops. Animals, though initially fearful, adapted and thrived in new ways. People began to understand that Earth itself was not hostile. It was protective. Something was guarding the planet, responding to both human activity and the intrusion of outsiders. Across the world, the tension grew. Ordinary citizens felt a mix of fear, awe, and wonder. Scientists worked tirelessly to interpret the data. Governments debated responses, and communities shared stories of unusual events in their regions. The more humans learned, the clearer it became that Earth was no ordinary planet. Something ancient and powerful was moving beneath their feet, shaping the world in ways humans could barely understand by now. The first signs of the Guardians' influence were undeniable. Large stone and metal structures could be seen rising from oceans and deserts. Massive energy pulses lit up the skies at night. Seismic activity, once minor and random, now followed patterns that hinted at intelligence. Humans who witnessed these events described a feeling of being small and fragile in comparison to the forces awakening around them. Yet they also felt a strange sense of protection, as if the planet itself was watching over them, preparing them for something greater. The awakening was far from complete, but humanity could sense that the events unfolding were part of a much larger story. Earth was responding to the extractors, and the Guardians were beginning to assert their presence. While humans were not yet fully aware of the alien intrusion, they could see the results: changes in the environment, anomalies in technology, and the first glimpses of ancient structures in villages, cities, and research centers. Humans watched, waited, and wondered. Scientists documented everything, sharing their findings with the world. Governments struggled to understand the full scale of the events. Ordinary people shared stories of strange phenomena that had never been seen before. And deep beneath the surface, the Guardians continued to awaken. Sensing a threat and preparing to protect the planet they had been tasked to defend by the end of this stage. The world had changed without most people realizing it. The disturbances were no longer just odd occurrences. They were the planet preparing for a confrontation that humanity had never imagined. Something ancient, powerful, and protective was stirring, and Earth was no longer a silent world. The Guardians were coming to life, and humans were beginning to understand that the planet had a will of its own, a will that could not be ignored. Deep beneath the Earth's surface, something extraordinary was happening. For millennia, the Guardians of Terra had lain dormant, their immense forms hidden under oceans, mountains, and deserts. They had been silent watchers, waiting for the day when the planet itself would need protection. But now, after weeks of disturbance caused by unknown forces above, they were awakening. The ground shook as massive structures shifted, rising slowly from the depths. Their surfaces, a mix of metal and stone, shimmered faintly as ancient energy coursed through their forms. The first of the Guardians broke through the crust in remote regions, unseen by most humans, but impossible to ignore by those nearby. The first witnesses were villagers, scientists, and explorers in isolated areas. One morning, a small team of researchers in a dense forest noticed the earth trembling beneath their feet. At first, they thought it was a small earthquake, something routine. But the ground cracked in unnatural patterns, and massive shapes began to rise, towering over the trees. The researchers froze, unsure whether to flee or study the phenomenon. The Guardians were immense, their forms unlike anything humans had ever imagined. covered in strange symbols and glowing faintly with a soft light. They moved with a purpose, not random motion. Even from a distance, it was clear that these beings were alive in some way. Their movements caused small earthquakes, ripples in lakes, and gusts of wind that swept through valleys. Birds and animals fled in panic, sensing something far beyond their understanding. Human witnesses felt an awe that was almost overwhelming. It was as if the planet itself had taken a form to watch over them, massive, silent, and undeniably powerful dot. As the Guardians rose in multiple locations, scientists around the world began to notice the changes. Seismic readings spiked dramatically, showing patterns that matched the movements of these enormous forms. Satellites captured faint energy signals moving across continents, pulses of light and power that could not be explained by any known technology. Communication networks in affected areas experienced intermittent failures, and electrical systems flickered as the planet's protective forces made themselves known. The extractors, high above in orbit, were unaware of what was unfolding. Their machines continued to harvest minerals and energy, operating on assumptions of efficiency and control. But slowly, their tools began to fail. Drills jammed as the ground beneath them shifted. Harvesting drones lost contact with command centers. Communications became erratic, and small explosions rocked the automated extraction platforms. The extractors, beings of logic and calculation, realized that Earth was not passive, but alive, and the forces awakening below were far older and more advanced than anything they had encountered. Back on the planet's surface, humans struggled to comprehend what they were seeing. Some reported encounters with the Guardians directly. A researcher on a remote island described a massive form emerging from the ocean, its body covered in intricate patterns that glowed faintly under the water. The Guardian moved deliberately, almost like it was scanning the surrounding environment. Energy waves pulsed from it, causing water to surge around it and sending shockwaves that rattled buildings miles away. Though terrifying in size and power, there was an undeniable intelligence in the way the Guardian moved, as if it was aware of the humans observing it. In deserts, similar awakenings occurred. Massive forms, resembling statues carved from stone and metal, shifted from their resting places, their glowing surfaces casting light over the barren land. Sandstorms whipped around them as they moved, revealing their immense height and strength. Local communities watched in disbelief, unsure whether to approach or hide. Some were frightened, believing these were omens of disaster. Others felt a strange sense of protection, as if the planet itself had sent these beings to guard humanity from an unknown threat. As the Guardians spread across the world, it became clear that their awakening was a response to the extractors' activity. Every time machines drilled too deep or harvested too aggressively, energy pulses would surge from the Guardians, disrupting operations and causing the ground to move. The extractors tried to react, sending drones and repair units, but nothing could match the ancient power now active beneath the Earth. The Guardians were designed to protect the planet, and nothing else mattered to them. Despite their size and power, the Guardians did not initially interact directly with humans. At first, humans were observers, forced to witness the planet's defense mechanism without fully understanding it. But something remarkable began to happen. The Guardians, scanning their surroundings with awareness beyond human comprehension, seemed to recognize a certain resonance in humans. Subtle signals, energy patterns within human bodies, matched the markers embedded in the planet and the Guardians themselves. It was as if humans were not merely inhabitants of Earth, but its intended successors, connected in ways they could not yet perceive. This recognition led to the first tentative interactions. In remote regions, researchers attempting to study the Guardians were not harmed. Machines that approached too closely were deactivated, but humans themselves were left untouched. The Guardians' pulses of energy were measured, recorded, and studied, revealing an intelligence that went beyond instinct or programming. They were not just machines or natural phenomena, they were protectors. Designed with purpose and awareness, humanity began to understand that the Guardians were responding to both the extractors and the planet itself. Every destructive act by the intruders triggered stronger responses, but ordinary human activity, research, observation, and respect for the environment was acknowledged without hostility. It was the first sign that humans could coexist with these ancient beings, if they understood their place and acted responsibly. Around the world, the awakening of the Guardians sparked awe, fear, and inspiration. Governments tried to mobilize scientific teams to make contact, while ordinary people watched the skies, oceans, and deserts for signs of these colossal beings. Social media exploded with footage and reports, many unverified, but enough to convince the world that something extraordinary was happening. News networks struggled to cover the story accurately, often resorting to interviews with local witnesses, who described scenes that seemed impossible: mountains shifting, oceans glowing, forests trembling as the Guardians moved through them. Meanwhile, the extractors grew desperate. Their assumption that Earth was defenseless was proven false. Their machines were failing, and their fleets were unable to adjust to the powerful forces below. Panic spread among their ranks, as logic-driven beings struggled to comprehend the awakening of forces that had no precedent in any of the galaxies they had previously visited. It became clear that their plan to harvest Earth's resources would not succeed without confrontation, and the odds were quickly turning against them. For humans observing from a distance, the presence of the Guardians began to feel like a revelation. These massive, intelligent beings were proof that Earth was more than just a planet. It was alive, protected, and aware. People felt a mixture of fear and reassurance. Fear because of the sheer power they witnessed. Reassurance because the planet seemed to have its own defenders, ensuring that the mistakes of humans or the greed of outsiders could not destroy it. In universities, laboratories, and observatories, teams of scientists worked day and night to understand the Guardians. They recorded energy pulses, mapped movements, and attempted to communicate in any way possible. Even though humans could not fully understand the language or signals of the Guardians, patterns began to emerge. It became clear that these beings were capable of learning, observing, and making decisions. The Guardians were selective in their actions, reacting strongly to threats while leaving humans alone if no harm was intended. By the end of this stage, the world had entered a new reality. Humans were no longer the dominant force on their own planet. They were witnesses to a power older than any civilization, older than human history itself. The Guardians had risen, the extractors were faltering, and Earth was beginning to assert itself in ways no one could have predicted. People everywhere began to realize that the planet they had always taken for granted was alive and aware, and that their future depended on understanding, respecting, and perhaps even cooperating with these incredible ancient beings. This was the full awakening of the Guardians of Terra, the moment when Earth went from a quiet, seemingly ordinary planet to a living, defended world. Humanity, once unaware of the forces beneath their feet, now faced the reality that the planet itself had protectors who would intervene when necessary. The stage was set for a confrontation with the extractors, and for humans to discover their place in a story far larger than they had ever imagined. After the awakening, the Guardians of Terra moved with purpose across the planet. Mountains shook as they shifted, oceans roared as they rose, and deserts cracked under their massive weight. Humans watched from a distance, initially terrified, but soon realized something extraordinary was happening. These beings, which had seemed unstoppable, were not attacking indiscriminately. They were responding to the presence of the extractors and to disturbances caused by drilling and harvesting. And more surprisingly, they seemed to sense humanity in a way no one understood. In a research outpost near the mountains, a group of scientists and engineers were the first to notice a subtle but remarkable pattern. The Guardians' energy pulses, which had at first caused panic, began to align with the movement of humans. When humans approached cautiously, the pulses softened. When machines intruded without thought or care, the pulses grew intense, shaking the ground and disabling equipment. It became clear that the Guardians were not blindly defensive. They could sense intent, and perhaps even something deeper, connected to humanity itself. The team realized they needed to find a way to communicate. The Guardians did not speak in any language humans knew. They did not make sounds that could be understood, but their pulses, movements, and energy emissions were deliberate. Researchers began using specialized instruments to measure the Guardian signals. They tried patterns of light, vibrations, and sound frequencies to see if the beings would respond. Slowly, small signs of acknowledgement appeared. A pulse would change when humans repeated a signal. A shift in the Guardian's position suggested it was observing, studying, or considering the human's actions. While scientists worked on decoding these signals, ordinary people continued to witness the Guardian's immense presence. Entire cities experienced tremors as these massive beings moved through the planet's crust. Yet there was no direct attack on humans. Farmers in affected areas noticed that their fields, previously damaged by unusual energy surges, were beginning to recover after the Guardians passed nearby. Rivers and lakes, previously disturbed, stabilized. Wildlife returned to places where it had fled. Slowly, humans began to sense that the Guardians were not enemies, they were protectors. The turning point came when a team of researchers approached one of the Guardians in a careful, coordinated manner. Using a combination of measured vibrations and carefully timed pulses of energy, they sent a signal. For hours, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the Guardian shifted closer, its massive body moving deliberately. The ground trembled beneath their feet, and a soft glow illuminated the surrounding forest. It was not violent. It was observing. It was listening. And for the first time, humans realized that communication, though primitive and limited, was possible. The Guardians' response encouraged other teams to try similar approaches. Light signals reflected off mirrors, patterns projected onto the sky, and controlled energy pulses were used to reach out. Each interaction was careful and deliberate. Humans quickly learned that sudden or aggressive movements would provoke strong defensive responses. But patient, respectful gestures were acknowledged. The Guardians were intelligent, and they could discern intention. It was a lesson in humility for humanity. These were beings older and wiser than any civilization, yet capable of recognition and understanding. Meanwhile, the extractors above the planet grew increasingly desperate. Their machines were being disrupted constantly, and they were unable to anticipate the Guardians' movements. Small attempts at communication or negotiation failed because the extractors did not understand the intelligence they were dealing with. And now, as humans began interacting with the Guardians, the balance of power was shifting. The extractors realized that Earth itself was fighting back in ways they had never imagined, and that humans were no longer passive observers. In laboratories around the world, scientists worked tirelessly to decode patterns and document interactions. Teams developed simple systems of signaling using light flashes, vibrations, and energy pulses. Humans learned to anticipate the Guardians' reactions, and over time, small coordinated exchanges became possible. The Guardians responded in ways that were deliberate, showing recognition and even subtle guidance. Humans began to understand that these were not mindless machines. They were sentient, aware, and capable of judgment. The first true sign of cooperation occurred when a Guardian moved to prevent a mining operation from destroying a delicate ecosystem. Instead of acting destructively, it redirected its energy in a way that pushed equipment away, preserving the area while avoiding harm to humans. Scientists observing the event realized that the Guardians were capable of nuanced judgment. They were not simply reacting with force, they were making decisions based on context, protecting both the planet and the humans who lived on it. Over the following weeks, humans and Guardians began to develop a cautious partnership. Humans provided guidance and observation, explaining what the extractors were doing and predicting their movements. The Guardians responded by protecting key areas, disabling machines that threatened the planet, and sending signals that helped humans anticipate further disturbances. This cooperation was delicate and required patience, but it marked a turning point. Humanity was no longer powerless. They had allies, ancient, intelligent Guardians whose strength dwarfed anything humans could muster on their own. The bond between humans and Guardians was not just practical, it was symbolic. Humanity began to see the planet differently. The Earth was not merely a home or a resource. It was alive, aware, and capable of defending itself through forces far older than human civilization. The Guardians represented that living force, a reminder that the planet had always had protectors in place, waiting for the right moment. Humans realized that their survival depended not only on their own technology, but on understanding and respecting these ancient beings. In the coming days, this cooperation became more structured. Teams of humans worked alongside Guardians to map areas at risk, study patterns of energy pulses, and prevent further damage from extractors. Communication, though limited, grew more effective. Humans learned to anticipate the Guardians' movements, and the Guardians adjusted to human presence, responding in ways that allowed safe observation and interaction. Together, they formed a network of defense that no single human or machine could achieve alone. The presence of the Guardians also changed public perception. News reports shifted from fear to fascination. Videos and images of Guardians interacting with humans went viral, sparking discussions about humanity's connection to the planet. People around the world began to understand that Earth itself was not passive. There was intelligence and care at work, and humans were being offered a chance to participate, to learn, and to protect alongside these incredible beings. For the extractors, this alliance was a shock. They had underestimated Earth's defenses and overestimated their own technological superiority. The cooperation between humans and Guardians meant that any further attempts to harvest resources would be met with coordinated resistance. Machines failed more frequently. Energy pulses interfered with navigation, and extraction sites were constantly disrupted. The extractors began to understand that Earth was not a passive target. They were facing a planet that had allies, intelligence and power beyond their understanding. Humans, for their part, learned valuable lessons. Patience, observation, and respect were essential when dealing with forces far greater than themselves. They began to document their interactions carefully, developing protocols for safe communication and cooperation. Scientists, explorers, and even ordinary citizens learned that their actions could influence the Guardians' responses. Small mistakes could trigger intense defensive measures, but careful, deliberate behavior could earn acknowledgement and protection. By the end of this stage, a new reality had emerged. Humans were no longer mere inhabitants of a planet threatened by outsiders. They were partners with ancient protectors, working together to safeguard Earth from exploitation. The Guardians had recognized humans as part of the planet's story, capable of participating in its defense and survival. And while the extractors still posed a threat above the atmosphere, the balance of power had shifted. Humanity now had allies older, stronger, and wiser than any civilization they had ever known. The stage was set for the next challenge, a confrontation with the extractors. But humanity faced it with something: new knowledge, cooperation, and the awareness that they were no longer alone. The Guardians had awakened, and for the first time in history, humans were not only witnesses to their planet's defense, they were part of it. The sky above Earth was no longer quiet. Massive ships of the Extractor Guild hovered in orbit, casting shadows over cities, forests, and oceans. They had been operating under the assumption that the planet was defenseless, but they were wrong. The guardians of Terra had fully awakened, and humans were no longer mere bystanders. A tense silence hung over the world as people watched the horizon, waiting for the inevitable clash. In command centers around the globe, scientists, military strategists, and government leaders coordinated with the guardians as best they could. Communication was primitive, relying on energy pulses, observation, and learned patterns. Yet even in this limited capacity, humans were able to advise the guardians on the locations of extraction sites, the movements of enemy drones, and the paths that would minimize civilian harm. Slowly, a strategy began to take shape. Humanity and the guardians would not attack recklessly, but would protect the planet while avoiding unnecessary destruction. The extractors, oblivious to the growing cooperation below, prepared their fleets for a major push. They believed that the failures they had experienced were minor setbacks, caused by technical malfunctions or planetary anomalies. They did not realize that Earth itself was fighting back, and that humans were now coordinating with forces far older and stronger than any they had ever faced. As their ships descended to lower orbits to resume harvesting, they were met with the first direct challenge. Massive forms emerged from the oceans, forests, deserts, and mountains simultaneously. The Guardians moved with precision, using their immense size and energy to block extraction platforms, disable machines, and prevent the harvesters from accessing critical resources. Their movements were deliberate, almost choreographed, as they worked together to protect key areas of the planet. Humans watched from the ground, reporting positions, calculating risks, and helping guide the Guardians to maximize efficiency and minimize collateral damage. The first clashes were overwhelming for the extractors. Machines designed to operate in the harshest environments malfunctioned in the presence of the Guardians' energy fields. Drills jammed mid-operation, ships lost propulsion, and drones plummeted out of the sky. The extractors attempted to retaliate with their weapons, but even their most advanced technologies struggled against beings designed to withstand cosmic threats. For the first time in their history, the extractors faced an opponent they could not outgun or outmaneuver. Humans played a crucial role in this confrontation. Scientists and strategists used satellite data, ground-based sensors, and observations of the Guardians' movements to predict extractor strategies. They identified weak points in the enemy fleet, areas where ships were vulnerable, or machines that could be redirected without risking human life. Every calculation, every decision was made under pressure, but it made a difference. Humans were no longer powerless. They were active participants in the defense of their planet. In coastal cities, Guardians rose from the oceans, their massive forms blocking entire harbors and cutting off extractor supply lines. Energy pulses disabled advanced machinery, preventing the enemy from repairing or continuing their operations. In forests, Guardians moved silently but deliberately, using their size to shield sensitive ecosystems and disrupt extractor drones. In deserts and mountains, they caused minor seismic shifts that redirected extraction vehicles and disabled power sources. Everywhere the extractors moved, they encountered resistance from a combination of human strategy and the Guardians' ancient power. The conflict was not just physical, it was psychological. The extractors had never faced an opponent that was both intelligent and unpredictable. Humans coordinated with beings whose thought processes were alien yet understandable, forming a network of strategy and defense that the extractors could not anticipate. Panic began to spread through their ranks as failures mounted. Their ships were trapped in orbit, drones were destroyed or disabled, and vital resources could no longer be harvested. The extractors realized that Earth was not a passive target, it was a planet with defenders, guided in part by the very species they had assumed would be irrelevant. Amid the chaos, humans on the ground experienced fear, awe, and determination. Cities trembled as guardians moved, but people knew that these beings were protecting them rather than threatening them. Families huddled together, watching the skies as the conflict unfolded above. Scientists and volunteers risked their safety to maintain communication lines, monitor the guardians, and provide vital information to coordinate defense. Ordinary citizens were witnesses to history, seeing forces beyond imagination in action, and understanding that their planet was no longer at the mercy of outsiders. As the confrontation escalated, the Guardians' coordination improved. Their energy pulses created barriers that deflected attacks. Their massive bodies blocked strategic points, and their calculated movements disrupted extractor operations across the globe. Humans provided guidance, helping the Guardians anticipate enemy strategies and avoid civilian areas. The combination of ancient power and human ingenuity created a defense unlike anything the extractors had faced. Before the turning point came when a large extraction fleet attempted to descend over a major mineral-rich region. Guardians from surrounding areas converged, forming an almost impenetrable barrier. Humans on the ground used energy pulses and signals to guide the Guardians' movements, predicting the extractors' attempts to maneuver and providing information to avoid direct conflict with inhabited areas. The extractors' machines failed in rapid succession. Their ships were forced to retreat, and their drones were disabled one by one. As the battle continued, the extractors realized that retreat was their only option. Their once confident fleets were crippled, their machines inoperative, and their plans completely disrupted. They had underestimated both the power of the Guardians and the resourcefulness of humanity. Every attempt to regain control ended in failure. For the first time in history, the extractors faced a planet that would not surrender. Guided by humans who had learned to work with forces far beyond their comprehension. On the ground, humans began to understand the depth of what had just occurred. They had witnessed ancient protectors acting to defend the planet, coordinated with them to protect cities, forests, and oceans, and played a key role in stopping an alien force that had assumed total control. Scientists documented every interaction, engineers analyzed the energy patterns, and communities shared stories of the awe-inspiring Guardians moving across the land. People everywhere began to feel a deep connection to their planet and the beings protecting it. The extractors, meanwhile, retreated into orbit, forced to abandon most of their operations. They had learned a lesson in humility. Earth was not an easy target, and humans were not passive observers. Their plans to exploit the planet's resources had failed spectacularly. The Guardians, once dormant and hidden, had demonstrated overwhelming power and intelligence. Humans had proven that they could cooperate with these ancient protectors, guiding and assisting them to safeguard their home. In the aftermath, the world entered a period of cautious reflection. Cities repaired damage from minor tremors and energy surges. Scientists continued to study the Guardians, learning more about their capabilities and understanding their role as protectors. Humans recognized the importance of respecting the planet, its ecosystems, and the ancient beings that had risen to defend it. And for the first time, humanity truly understood that Earth was not just a place to live, it was a living, aware entity with protectors older than any human civilization. The confrontation with the extractors had changed everything. Humanity had faced an external threat and survived, not by relying solely on weapons or technology, but by cooperating with forces far greater than themselves. The Guardians had awakened fully, and humans had proven their ability to act as partners in the defense of their planet. The extractors' defeat was not only a victory of force, it was a victory of cooperation, intelligence, and understanding. By the end of this stage, Earth was no longer a passive world. It had defenders, allies, and a population that now understood its significance in ways they had never imagined. The extractors had been driven away, but humanity and the Guardians knew that vigilance was still required. The planet had awakened, its protectors were active, and humans were no longer just witnesses. They were participants in an epic story that had been written across millennia. The skies above Earth slowly cleared after the battle. The Extractor Guild had retreated, their ships scattered across the edges of space, crippled and humiliated. For the first time in history, humanity had not only survived an external threat, but had done so with the aid of forces older than time itself. The Guardians of Terra, having fulfilled their immediate purpose, began to move more deliberately, spreading across the planet to stabilize ecosystems, repair environmental damage, and reassert their presence as protectors. People everywhere watched in awe. Massive structures that had once seemed like legends were now part of reality. In oceans, huge forms moved beneath the surface, maintaining currents and restoring balance. In forests, guardians realigned broken land and repaired habitats that had been damaged by centuries of human activity. In deserts, they shifted sands and redirected energy flows, stabilizing regions that had been at risk of collapse. Humanity had not only witnessed the power of the Guardians, they had begun to see the planet as a living entity, capable of care, awareness, and protection. In cities, people began to process the enormity of what had happened. For months, strange tremors, energy pulses, and mysterious lights had dominated their lives. Now, as the immediate danger passed, the world began to reflect on the lessons learned. Scientists documented every observation, analyzing patterns in the Guardians' movements and the energy they emitted. Engineers attempted to understand how these ancient forces interacted with human technology. Leaders discussed new policies for environmental protection, recognizing that the survival of humanity was closely tied to the health and stability of the planet. For ordinary people, the changes were just as profound. Families walked through forests that had been restored, witnessed rivers flowing more clearly than they had in decades, and marveled at oceans that seemed alive with unseen currents. The Guardian's presence was no longer a source of fear, but a reminder that humanity was part of something far greater than itself. Children grew up knowing that the planet was not silent or passive, but alive, capable of responding. And guided by protectors older than human history, scientists and researchers worked tirelessly to deepen their understanding of the Guardians. Using advanced instruments, they studied energy patterns, recorded communication pulses, and observed movements across different terrains. Slowly, patterns emerged and intelligence and purpose behind every action. Humans realized that the Guardians were not merely reactive. They had their own understanding of the planet, its needs, and the threats that could endanger it. And they seemed to recognize humanity as a partner, capable of learning, adapting, and participating in Earth's defense. Governments began to cooperate more closely with scientific communities to ensure that future interactions with the Guardians would be safe and productive. Policies were created to minimize environmental damage, regulate resource use, and preserve areas critical to both human life and the Guardians' activities. Humanity had learned the hard way that Earth was not a resource to exploit blindly, but a living system to respect, understand, and protect. The Guardians themselves seemed to take notice of these changes. Areas previously damaged by human activity were restored more rapidly than before. The energy pulses they emitted became less destructive and more stabilizing. Their movements were coordinated in ways that suggested careful observation and judgment. Humans could sense that the Guardians were acknowledging effort, learning from interaction, and gradually allowing for a deeper cooperation that had been impossible before the battle. In addition to environmental restoration, humanity began to understand its own place in a larger cosmic story. The Guardians revealed, in subtle ways humans could perceive, that Earth had been a protected world for millennia. Ancient species, long gone, had seeded the planet with these beings to ensure its survival. Humans were not accidental inhabitants. They were the successors of a plan it extended beyond the memory of civilization. This realization brought both awe and responsibility. Humanity had been entrusted with the care of a living planet, and the Guardians were a reminder of the weight of that trust. Communication between humans and Guardians, while still limited, improved steadily. Energy pulses were refined into patterns that could convey warnings, guidance, and acknowledgement. Humans learned to interpret these signals, and in turn sent messages of their own. While the language of the Guardians was beyond human comprehension, the basics of intention, caution, and cooperation became clear. A new partnership was forming, one that would define humanity's future on the planet. The lessons from the extractor guilds. Attempted conquest were stark. Humanity understood that their planet could not be taken lightly by outsiders. The Guardians had been prepared to defend it for millennia, but humans now realized they also had a role to play. Technology alone could not ensure survival. Wisdom, respect, and collaboration were equally important. This understanding began to reshape society, inspiring new approaches to education, environmental policy, and exploration. Humans were no longer just observers of Earth's story, they were participants, responsible for its well-being in remote areas. Where the Guardians had intervened most dramatically, local communities began to adapt to this new reality. Villagers who once feared strange lights and tremors and treated these events as signs of protection. They shared stories of Guardians appearing to shield settlements from environmental hazards or redirect natural disasters. These experiences were recorded, celebrated, and passed on, creating a new cultural understanding of humanity's connection to the planet. Scientists working in urban centers found that their models of Earth had changed completely. Previously, humans had assumed that natural forces were predictable and separate from intelligent life. Now, it was clear that the planet itself was an active participant in its own preservation. The Guardians were the physical embodiment of that intelligence, but humans realized that their actions mattered. Pollution, deforestation, and reckless exploitation could still provoke responses. Cooperation and care were no longer optional. They were essential. The extractors' retreat offered humanity another perspective. These beings, who had assumed total control, had been defeated not by superior firepower alone, but by a combination of intelligence, cooperation, and respect for the forces that had existed long before them. Humans had learned that arrogance and greed could not succeed against a living planet, and that survival required humility and understanding. The world collectively absorbed this lesson, shaping policies and attitudes for generations to come. As months passed, the Guardians continued their work, gradually restoring balance to the planet. Rivers flowed steadily, forests grew stronger, and oceans stabilized. Humans who interacted closely with the Guardians noticed subtle guidance. Areas of environmental concern were highlighted through energy pulses, and movement patterns suggested optimal approaches to protect delicate ecosystems. It was as if the planet itself was teaching humanity how to live responsibly within its systems. Humanity also began to look outward. The knowledge that ancient, intelligent forces existed on Earth inspired curiosity about the universe. If Earth had protectors older than human civilization, what else might exist among the stars? Scientists, philosophers, and ordinary people alike began to consider their place in a much larger cosmic story. The Guardians had not only protected the planet, they had awakened humanity to the reality that the universe was far greater than they had imagined. In daily life, people grew more aware of the planet's rhythms. Farmers adapted planting schedules to natural energy flows. Cities incorporated designs that minimized environmental disruption. Communities began to celebrate and respect the Guardians' presence, understanding that these beings were essential allies in a delicate balance. Humanity had learned to observe, listen, and respond to the planet in ways they never had before. The most profound change, however, was in mindset. Humanity no longer saw Earth as a passive home or a collection of resources. The planet was alive, aware, and capable of defending itself. Humans had experienced firsthand that they were part of a larger story, one that stretched back millennia and would continue far into the future. The Guardians had awakened, not just to protect the planet, but to teach humanity its place within a living system. By the end of this new era, Earth was transformed. Cities, forests, rivers, and oceans had all begun to stabilize under the guidance of the Guardians. Humans had learned to cooperate with these ancient protectors, understanding that intelligence, patience, and respect were more powerful than force alone. The extractors were gone, humiliated and defeated, leaving the planet safe for the first time in decades. Humanity had entered a new chapter. They were no longer simply inhabitants of Earth. They were stewards, responsible for its preservation, aware of its intelligence, and partners with forces far older than themselves. The Guardians of Terra had fulfilled their initial purpose, but they remained ever vigilant, ensuring that the balance of life and the safety of the planet would continue. Humans had learned their place in the grand story. Earth was not theirs alone, but theirs to protect, to respect, and to honor. And as night fell over the planet, the Guardians' glowing forms moved silently across oceans, deserts, forests, and mountains. Humanity watched,